welcome to Into the Massiverse. This is episode 15, where we are going to be discussing House of Sky and Breath, the second book in the Crescent City series by Sarah J Maas. And this is the final recap we'll be doing in this upload session because the new Crescent City book is about to come out and we will have got everyone caught up on what happens in the Massiverse. Now, before we jump into this final story recap, I figure at this point we should quickly talk about all of the linkages we have seen post the first Crescent City book with broader Massiverse elements. Because, as pointed out in our recap of Crescent City 1, we are hearing things repeated to us that we've heard before in other Massiverse books. A perfect example of this is the story of Eneleus's fight at the top of Ramiel that takes place in Prythian. It's like the founding of the blood right for the Illyrians. They call Eneleus the first Illyrian. And in the first Crescent City book, we hear of a story where Prince Peleus fights the demon Apollyon of the Pit. And the way the fight plays out is almost identical. We also have elements in the first Crescent City of things like traveling between dimensions. The inhabitants of Midgard have all come from other locations at about the 15,000 years ago mark. An amount that didn't seem that significant at the time, but in watching my own recaps back, the language the Kelpie speaks in A Court of Silver Flames is said by Amron and Rhys to have not been spoken in about 15,000 years. So those timelines pretty much add up. We also have the presence of creatures like witches in the world of Crescent City, which we were obviously introduced to back in Throne of Glass. In Erelea, there are two kinds of witches, Croken witches and Iron Teeth witches, though we are very much informed that Iron Teeth witches are descended from Valg, interdimensional parasitic beings that are the baddies in the Throne of Glass series. Both Maeve and Erwin are Valg creatures that have seemingly come from another world. Erwin is one of 3 Valg kings who have travelled from realm to realm, conquering them, whilst Maeve had escaped the brothers and situated herself in Erelea, where they eventually hunted her down. So interdimensional travel has been established all the way back from the beginning of the Massiverse. Remember when I said in my recap of Throne of Glass, book 1 in all of the Massiverse, that we were getting interdimensional stuff very, very quickly? Well, at this point, we're kind of looping back to this concept. It's also worth stating that the weird keys in Throne of Glass are black stones. And in the first Crescent City book, we heard a lot about obsidian salt, the item used to summon demons. It's very much giving ground up weird keystone kind of vibes, which is interesting as both seem to facilitate interdimensional travel. Now, at the end of the Throne of Glass series, Selena closes doors between her world and all other worlds, and then proceeds to fall through realms, where we know she sees Lunathian and is actually helped by Rhysand. The timing of Aylin's fall through the universe lines up with the red star in the sky during Skyfall in Silver Flames, because we see Feyre pregnant, stood next to Rhys. These are all looking far too similar to be coincidences. And when this book came out, all everyone had were questions. There are also a couple of Crescent City specific elements that I want to mention just before we dive into A House of Sky and Breath that I didn't mention in my recap of book 1, but I feel will be beneficial to us all now. Each of the books in the Crescent City series is named after a house. The inhabitants of Midgard are split into houses. When she becomes an honorary member of the Pack of Devils, Bryce is officially a member of the House of Earth and Blood, to which creatures like werewolves belong. The House of Sky and Breath is the house that both angels and fae technically belong. Now that Bryce has been outed as the daughter of the Autumn King of the Fae, she is technically a member of the House of Sky and Breath, like Hunt. There are other houses, and the logic follows that the subsequent books will each be named after one of the houses. Book 3 is a House of Flame and Shadow. I also didn't mention an important fact about Hunt. I did say that we didn't know who his father was, but his mother was basically an angel servant. She was an indentured servant, so kind of a slave. And even though Hunt is incredibly powerful, he has always been at the lower social echelon of angeldom. I also forgot to talk about the Autumn King's fixation with space. He has basically a diagram of the solar system in his office. He is very into studying the stars. And something very interesting we saw in A Court of Silver Flames is that Rhys has a very similar item in his office. Dun, dun, dun. We're also very much getting the vibe that the Fae in Midgard are incredibly, incredibly similar to the Fae of Prythian in terms of how their powers work, in terms of some elements of their history. And there's something quite culturally interesting about the Fae of Midgard that I didn't mention in my Crescent City 1 summary video. Lots of the Fae are seen as incredibly, incredibly traditional. They are nostalgic for their homeland, the place they originally all came from, and try to maintain traditions and aesthetics of that original home, wherever it may be, alive. So they are quite traditional and conservative, and high-ranking noble members of the Fae in Midgard, like Rune and Bryce and the Autumn King, all maintain the practice of learning the language of Old Fae. So of all the people in Midgard, there is a small pool of people who speak this language. Both Bryce and Rune are two of them. This may come to factor into the plot of this book. But we also have heard of a very distinct and separate group of Fae who live on an island called Avalon. Rue's mother is an Avalon Fae, and they live out on an island surrounded by magical mist that it is incredibly, incredibly hard for anyone to get to. They treat themselves distinctly and differently to the Valbaran Fae. And Rue's father married his mother very much so that his child would have all the benefits of being a Valbaran Fae and all of the unique magical elements associated with the Avalon Fae, who are quite famous for their dark hair, bluey purpley eyes, and shadow magic. It's all sounding very coincidental. It sounds like I am getting very specific here, but the concept of Avalon Fae is going to be very, very important. Maybe not in this book, but I'm putting my money on it, guys. She's a fan of the Dusk Court theory, just saying it right now. But bearing all of this in mind, let's get started and begin our complete summary of everything that happens in A House of Sky and Breath, the second book in the Crescent City series by Sarah J Maas. Now, this book starts, quite confusingly, not focusing on Bryce, not focusing on Hunt, not focusing on a character we have ever met or heard of before. Because the beginning of this book is following a young woman called Sophie, whose parents have been killed, and her brother is currently imprisoned in a work camp. Sophie has joined in with the human rebel group to try and get her younger brother Emil out of this compound. So we join Sophie on this mission to save her younger brother. And we find out that both Sophie and Emil are Vanir, but they are supposedly an incredibly rare kind of Vanir called Thunderbirds. The rebels are very, very interested in having Sophie and Emil help them out in the war, and this is how Sophie has gained access to the rebels and got them to help her save her little brother's life. Sophie breaks into the camp and has a group of children with her, one of whom is Emil, and she sneaks them out of the camp and takes them towards the harbour where her partner, Agent Silver, is waiting for her. Unfortunately for Sophie, the rebels helping them out, and the children, the Dread Wolves are out. This is a group of Asteri supporting hunters. And this group of shapeshifters specifically work for the Asteri, hunting down people of value, and they are led by a shapeshifter called the Hind. The Hind is a member of this like super group of baddies who will work for the Asteri, and she shapeshifts into a deer. How interesting, of all the animals a main character in this series could turn into, the Hind turns into a deer. Where have we seen the important symbol of a deer or like a stag before? Could be a coincidence, or is it? Basically, the Hind has this group of hunters and they track down people for the Asteri. And they are now hunting down Sophie because Thunderbirds are incredibly powerful and incredibly rare. Exactly the kind of thing the Asteri want to get their hands on. There is a confrontation down on the harbour. Sophie manages to help the children escape. But Sophie fights the Dreadwolves off using her Thunderbird powers. So at the very beginning of this book, we're introduced to an entirely new kind of magical being and get to see Sophie use her powers. And they are insane. They are incredibly cool. Much like we've seen Hunt kind of ish wield lighting, we've not seen him do it a lot yet. Thunderbirds use and can control electricity. So Sophie literally pulls all of the electricity from the houses and properties around her and wields it as a weapon. Unfortunately, though, Sophie does not manage to escape. She is very much captured. We see her tossed into the water with a weight around her legs. And just as everyone is leaving the scene, the Hind drops a stone at exactly the point where Sophie has been dropped underwater. She whacks this stone in the sea with her. And thus ends this little weird sojourn that we don't know the meaning of yet at the beginning of this book. Cut over to my bays, Bryce and Hunt, who are living it up in the Crescent City. They're on a night out at the opera, and we get to meet Bryce's mother, Ember, and her stepdad, Randall, because they're going out, the four of them, to this super fancy event. And when Hunt turns up, he has had the iconic Sarah J Maas hot guy haircut. He has had this long shoulder-length hair buzzed at the sides, and we all collectively gasp. It is said while they're in the opera house that Hunt looks the spitting image of one of the statues thereby. And this happens to be a statue of the god of thunder, Thur, who wields a hammer. Which is quite cool, seeing as Hunt's power is lightning. There may be a connection here. There may not. Religion in the Massiverse is quite interesting. We see literal gods in Throne of Glass, and some of the deities mentioned in Crescent City sound very similar but have different names. But there's a distinct possibility that we're talking about the same godly characters across series. Turns out what Bryce and Hunt are doing at the minute is they are getting closer and closer as friends. And in order to not mess up this good thing they've got going, they've promised that they will not sleep with each other until after the solstice. They've put a little deadline in place of like, let's just continue to get to know each other. Our relationship had quite an odd beginning. Let's focus on being friends until the solstice, when we can allow things to morph into the relationship we all know is coming. Cut to the absolute iconic Rune Dunnan knew 3 things to be true. Because Rune is hosting this insane house party that is interrupted by the arrival of Rune's cousin, Cormac. Cormac is an Avalon Fae and a prince. He arrives at this party, starts mouthing off, and we find out that Bryce's father has decided to betroth Bryce to Cormac. Now that she's the starborn heir, everyone's very interested in Bryce, and she can't believe that her dad has done this, and neither can Rune, because Rune hates Cormac with a passion. We find out that Rune was sent over to Avalon as a teenager to train and undergo a trial. During that trial, Cormac and Rune fought each other. They were both very much trying to obtain the special Avalon sword that we have seen Rune carry around. The special swords in the Massiverse as a whole are all really, really cool. But this is one we know now belongs to Rune. And this sword is meant to belong to the Starborn heir. And in a very Excalibur-esque trial, Cormac tries to win it, and Rune wins it instead. He earns it. It also really bothers Cormac that this magic sword also seems to have a real affinity for Bryce. It doesn't want Cormac to own it. It wants to be with Rune and Bryce. We also find out that this magic sword has a matching dagger. But we don't know where the dagger is. And there is a prophecy that when the dagger and the sword come together, so will the Fae people be reunited. We have in the Massiverse seen a special dagger before, because one of the Bat Boys, our handsome spy master Azriel, has a special dagger called Truth Teller that we saw Elaine kill the King of Hybern with. I wonder if these two things are connected. Anyway, we then go to Tharion, who, I'm not going to lie, guys, I'm not a massive Tharion fan. And he has been sent by the River Queen to go and find Sophie's body over at the harbour. He swims over there and finds the lead blocks that she was tied to down at the bottom of the sea, but does not find Sophie's body. Dun, dun, dun. Bryce heads home to her apartment, and Ethan is there. They've not been speaking a lot, but Ethan turns up bloody and bruised because he has spoken out against Amelie and basically been kicked out of the pack. Ethan is now a packless werewolf because he defended Bryce during an argument. So he had nowhere else to go and heads to Bryce, the friend he's treated pretty badly, to be frank. Although Ethan has his reasons. I like Ethan. My brother's name's Ethan, so that was always going to happen. The Autumn King tells Rune and Cormac. He gets them together and he says, look, you are each marrying who I tell you to marry. Cormac, you're marrying Bryce. Rune, you're marrying Hypaxia. And you will have beautiful, powerful babies. It is at this point we find out that Hypaxia, who we met as the Med Witch in Book 1 and who freed Hunt from his magical bindings of slavery, is a necromancer. She is a witch that can control the dead, and everyone is very, very frightened of her. She's only just come to power as the new head of the witches, and the witch society is matriarchal, like the witch societies we have seen in Throne of Glass. And Hypaxia has a half-sister. Hypaxia's mother basically went around and had children with the most powerful men she could. The deal being that if that child was a witch, she would have them. If it wasn't, the father would get to keep them. So while Hypaxia is a witch and has been raised a witch by her mother, her half-sister, Lydia, turned out to be a deer shapeshifter, now better known as the Hind. So Hypaxia, who we've already met, her sister's the baddie, the Hind. Ah! It is one of many, many good reveals in this book. Tharion manages to swim along and find the boat that Emil and the rest of them all escaped on, and it looks like they've all headed towards Crescent City. Hunt gets to meet his new boss. Obviously, Mika is gone, and we need a new ruler of Crescent City. Enter the Archangel Celestina, and she actually seems really nice and cool and sweet. Problem is, Celestina has also taken on some of the responsibilities Sandriel, also dead in the last book, had. So she has taken over Sandriel's evil squad of baddies. One of which is the Hind, another the Harpy. They all basically have nicknames that start with H. But she brings with her to Crescent City towards the start of this book, Bastion and Pollux, who Hunt hates. If you remember, Hunt used to live under and work for Sandriel, so he is very familiar with this particular group of Baddens, of which you could claim Hunt was one. The Hunter, this group, who all have H nicknames. Straight away, Hunt and Pollux get into a fight. And I'm going to tell you right now, Pollux, Baden all the way through. We hate Pollux. And I feel like in the next book, we're going to hate him even more. But when we say he's a Baden, he is a bad one. So Hunt and Pollux, they basically start beefing straight away. And Hunt ends up getting put in a cell. It's like, separate these two, keep them apart. And Bryce literally has to come and get him out of trouble. Like, it's like they've rung his mum, like, he's been misbehaving, come pick him up, please. That kind of behavior. We then have the wheels are turning to build up the main plot of this book. If you're going to describe the plot of book one, it's a murder mystery buddy cop kind of story. This plot, however, kicks off with Tharian discovering that Sophie, the Thunderbird, had been communicating with someone in Crescent City. He finds messages and realizes Sophie, the Thunderbird, knew and had been talking to our girl Danica Fendra. What? More Danica shenanigans? You bet there are. So Tharian goes to tell Bryce, here's what's happened. We've been hunting this woman, Sophie. She is a Thunderbird. She is supposedly drowned, but she was there saving her Thunderbird brother, Emil. And it looks like Emil has made his way into the Crescent City. This child is here somewhere. And BT dubs, this girl Sophie, she knew your girl Danica. Somehow things are interlinked, but we've got a missing child who we think may have incredible power and who many people are going to want to get their hands on. So Bryce immediately is like, okay, I want to go and find this child and save him. Because Bryce is a nice woman. The fact that there is some kind of linkage with Danica also does not hurt. If Danica knew Sophie, and if Danica was still alive, she'd probably want to help this child out. So Bryce gets involved. Don't forget, both Bryce and Hunt have been told by the Asteri to keep their heads down. If they raise their heads above the parapet, there will be trouble. We find out that in the buddy cop situation Hunt has at work, he is now partnered with Baxian. Okay, no buddying up with Isaiah anymore. His new partner for work is Baxian, who Hunt makes it very clear he does not like. And Baxian quips back that Hunt is actually really bad at just judging people on a superficial level. Hunt's never made any effort to get to know Baxian and's just decided he doesn't like him from day dot and continues to be awful to him. So we're kind of like, whoa, Baxian, you care a lot. Maybe you're not all rotten, bad guy. Tharian and Ethan end up linking up because why not? And to be fair, Ethan is having to stay at Bryce's flat. And they get chatting away and they realize that Danica was researching something dangerous. We've not only had this stuff with the footage and synth, she was actually looking into something else, something bigger, something scary. They just don't 100% know what at this point. But there is a lot more going on with the mysteries of what Danica was doing before she died. We then get a reveal that really upsets Bryce because Fury tells Bryce that Danica was actually a bloodhound, basically allowed her to find facts out about people simply by smelling them. And when Bryce hears this, she realizes that something like her paternity, a very closely guarded secret it took her a long time to tell Danica, is exactly the kind of thing Danica would have known straight away when meeting Bryce. It's the kind of